Now, I've spoken of this process so far largely from the point of view of the, as it were, exporting nations. And what I'd like to do now is to, as it were, hop over the Mediterranean and see how this thing worked from a European perspective. The importation of Arab science, and to a much lesser extent philosophy, seems to have begun in the 9th century, still during the Dark Ages, in other words, with the translation into Latin of a few minor works that, by almost random processes, came into the hands of the Latins. But this process was really inaugurated in a serious way by somebody called Gerbert. Quite a brilliant mind, Gerbert of Aurillac in France, and he later becomes Pope as Pope Sylvester II, dying in 1003. And Gerbert is in a better position than most of his compatriots to know about Arab science, because in his early 20s he had been wandering around Catalonia, almost the sort of medieval equivalent of a present-day hitchhiker. He just wandered around and stayed in monasteries or wherever. And Catalonia at that time was only very recently recaptured from the Muslims. There were still memories of Muslim cultural activities. Many books were still around. And there's even a colourful legend current amongst the medievals that Gerbert also travelled to Cordoba, where he took a Muslim teacher in the great mosque. And the legend goes on to say that he seduced the daughter of this teacher and stole his books and ran back to Europe with them. And in that way, scholastic theology and the early medieval Renaissance began. There's no evidence to suggest, however, that he was ever in Cordoba, but certainly he was in Catalonia, where he was exposed to aspects of the Muslim heritage. Gerbert, very brilliant, although in the 10th century more or less a lone figure, was the leading astronomer and mathematician of his time in Europe, largely because of what he had learnt from the Muslims. He also introduces the astrolabe into Europe. As far as medicine goes, again another practical science that often traverses cultural barriers more rapidly than do some other things. Early medieval Europe was extremely retarded in medical matters. The only people who tried to make a difference were the Benedictines, who very often would open little clinics attached to their monasteries. Particularly well known was the great Benedictine house at Monte Cassino. The Benedictines also occupied themselves increasingly with translating, particularly this book, which they were very fond of, the Liber Regius, which is the summary of Raz's larger work. But slowly, as people recognize, albeit sometimes reluctantly, the extraordinary merit of the Arab sciences, a tradition of translation starts to grow, and it becomes more culturally acceptable that one rejects the Muslim religion, but nonetheless can consistently say that one is open to more secular aspects of Muslim thought. This kind of duality is very characteristic of the medieval mind. And for obvious reasons, this translation process gains momentum, particularly in Spain. Spain was a great area of overlap, particularly once the Muslim tide starts to recede, leaving little Muslim communities or Islamized Jewish communities or Mozarabic Christian communities speaking Arabic, having access to these texts, marooned, as it were, at the high water mark. And this gathers momentum following the conquest of Toledo in 1085. Immediately we find, as I mentioned last time, Peter the Venerable, who comes up with this Cluniac corpus, which is mainly interested in understanding Islam and constructing a polemic against it, less relevant for the purposes of this lecture. But we find, more interestingly, visiting Toledo, somebody called Dominic Giundisalvi. He is an archdeacon of Segovia, devout Christian, but nonetheless very open to learning from the Saracens. And he teams up with a converted Jew called Ibn Dawood. Giundisalvi himself appears not to have known Arabic particularly well, but the common pattern for these European translations was for them to be done in pairs, with a Christian cleric polishing the Latin, and for the raw translation being done by a native speaker of the language. There are 4 or 5 very well-known instances of such a partnership. So he teams up with this Ibn Dawood, and starts to translate some of this, this rich Arabic legacy. Another important figure in this process, probably the second most important, is a certain Gerard of Cremona, dies in 1187, who translates over 100 books. The mathematical heritage is generally translated into Latin by somebody called Plato of Tivoli, who's operating in Barcelona on the eastern coast of Spain. Translates a lot of these key texts of geometry and astronomy. Another key figure, this time from England, was the monk Abdal of Bath. And we don't know too much about where he picked up his Muslim learning, but it seems that he probably travelled not just in the Christianized bits of Spain, but in Muslim Spain proper. There's another legend that suggests that he went and studied in the great mosque of Cordoba. And he's the one who translates Al-Khwarizmi. Remember this towering figure of mathematics and of geometry. And when he returns to England, he becomes involved in the group that set up the University of Oxford. Another Brit was Michael Scott, who dies in 1236. We know, spent time in Toledo, and generally the medievals were very hostile towards him because he seems to have been a kind of almost free-spirited person. And their way of polemicizing against that, his excessive sympathy for the Saracen learning, was to describe him as a sort of occultist, a magician or a wizard. So Dante has a very long graphic explanation of how he'll be punished amongst other wizards and sorcerers in the Inferno. Interesting thing about Michael Scott is that he's also interested in the Muslim remains in Sicily. He travels to the court of the great Frederick II, who's the king of Sicily. Very extravagant, again rather free-willing, open-minded monarch, known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, because of the extraordinary things he did, eventually excommunicated. And he basically surrounds himself in this court with Saracen traditions. He eats Saracen food, he learns Arabic, he has Arabic physicians and philosophers at his court. He develops an appreciation for Arabic poetry. And he even, particularly shocking to the medieval mind, takes a bath every day, which was one of the reasons officially cited for his excommunication. One of the least comprehensible aspects of medieval history is the way in which, following the decline of the Roman Empire, that great Roman institution, the thermae, or the public baths, immediately shut down. So when Byzantium enters the Christian faith, although obviously it had tremendous advantages, one drawback was that they immediately closed down the public baths. But this tradition is maintained in the Muslim world even today, the famous hammam, the Turkish bath, and so forth. But for medieval monks, this was regarded as something really a bit outrageous. And even today, in Eastern Christian spirituality, you'll still find a few people who regard physical hygiene as in some strange way incompatible with Christian faith. A friend of mine was spending time at a monastery in Greece. He travelled from monastery to monastery, this was back in the 60s, never saw a single bath or a shower. And he became so horrified with this that one day while the monks were at prayer, he filled up the big stone tank where they washed their habits with water and sat down and had a good tub. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a monk appears shouting at him and accuses him of desecrating the monastery, etc., etc., and he has to jump out and run back to his room as nature intended. How such a cultivation of uncleanness can be coupled with the gospel ethic, I don't know, but it's certainly a recurrent feature of medieval Europe. You find sometimes in Muslim discussions of how to deal with these nasty crusaders, the advice that you should keep your distance because they're a bit smelly. How are we doing? Sorry?
His name?
The name, the emperor?
Yes.
Frederick II.
Frederick.
Yeah. So he goes around in a turban and sort of nice silk oriental clothes, and this is just too much for the establishment. Frederick's an interesting example of a particular type of Christian. It's all too easy to assume that all medieval Christians were kind of rabidly hostile to anything that came from the wrong side of the Mediterranean, or to Muslim life or respect for Muslims. But Frederick II, as I've mentioned, while remaining, it seems, a Christian, was actually very sympathetic to his Muslim subjects. Many Sicilians at that time were still Muslim. Another example of this, not to be forgotten, is the great Alphonse X of Spain, known as Alfonso el Sabio, Alphonse the Wise, dies in 1284, rules the still largely Muslim city of Cordoba. And if you go to this museum, which I mentioned earlier, which is called something like the Museum of Medieval Cordoba, I can't remember its exact name, it's a very up-to-date, high-tech museum, and you go into one room, and it's completely dark except for 4 life-sized waxworks. And one of them is Ibn Rushd, the Muslim philosopher and jurist of Cordoba. One of them is Ibn Arabi, the great Muslim mystic, also taught in Cordoba. One of them is Maimonides, another Cordoban. And the fourth is the great Christian king, Don Alfonso el Sabio. And one of the unnerving things about this museum is that they actually talk to you. Right? You turn to one of these waxworks and immediately he starts talking to you. And you can choose what language he speaks in. Sadly, they don't have Arabic or Latin in the range of choices, which would be the most obvious ones. And the English translation is this impossibly fruity sort of 19th century public school thing. And to be addressed by Maimonides in those terms is somewhat disorienting. I took she was then 3-year-old daughter in to see this, and she was completely staggered by this phenomenon. But Alfonso el Sabio is an important reminder that it was indeed possible for medieval Christians, including monarchs, to be open to this Arab heritage.